Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5. I am your host, curator Kevin Adkisson with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And today we will be taking a little tour through the 1937 Thornlea studio behind me. So, in earlier tours, I think we've done 2 tours through Thornlea House, which is directly opposite this beautiful lawn. And Thornlea House was completed in the late 1920s and was the home of Cranbrook founders George and Ellen Booth's youngest son, Henry, and Henry's wife, Carolyn, and their 5 children. And so if you enjoy today's tour of the studio, you can scroll back in time and you can see my earlier Live at 5 where we toured the main house. Now, Henry and Carolyn had quite a bit of property here. And so if I turn my camera, Cranbrook House is just at the top of the hill here. And so they're right on the opposite side of Cranbrook Road. And Henry Booth, who was an architect trained at the University of Michigan, he then was in practice with Bob Swanson in the 1920s. They built the administrative building at the Art Academy, and they also were associated with Eliel Saarinen's first buildings at Cranbrook School. But in 1937, Henry Booth had stopped practicing as a licensed architect. And he had his office at Cranbrook with the Cranbrook Foundation as part of the leadership there. But he realized that he needed to have a place to do his own work. And so in 1937, he sketched out plans to be able to build a little building in the backyard of Thornlea, where he could work. In his words, it would be a place to follow his personal interests, whatever they might be. And so he would work on his watercolors and his architectural sketches. And eventually he came to use this house for meetings, like of the Oakland Citizens League and the Junior League sales that would happen. And so it is amazing that a house with as 10,000 square feet, he needed more space. But they did build this little cottage in 1937. During the war years, when George and Ellen Booth were just living in the service wing of Cranbrook House, the Henry and Carolyn Booths decided to move here. And so the 5 children lived in this house in order to conserve energy and fuel during a time of war rationing. Melinda Booth, the youngest, she actually decided the big house was way too ostentatious, and she wanted to move here full time. So we'll go inside in a moment. There's not terribly much to see inside, in part because the house is still used as a residence, and we won't be touring through the collection fellow apartment that is upstairs, which is half of the building. Now, there is a gate to Thornlea over here, designed by Henry Booth, and so you see its sort of diagrid at the top, and then the slender iron rods down below with the wonderful little tridents popping up. And that's the rainbow fountain on the back of the Japanese garden straight ahead. Now, the front door, if there is a front door to the studio, is on this side. And that is the apartment up above. And we'll see from the other side the little window there on the door, which is a thistle for Henry's nickname. Now, the name Thornlea, as I've mentioned before, comes from this site being formerly a thorny meadow. And the architect of this building, while it was sketched out by Henry Scripps Booth himself, it was drawn up by his friend and classmate at the University of Michigan, Ralph Calder. And so Ralph Calder was one of Henry Booth's classmates at the University of Michigan. Calder became the first winner, or an early winner, of the George Goff Booth Travel Fellowship at the University of Michigan School of Architecture, which is still being awarded. You can go online and you can see close to 100 years of George Booth Fellows at the University of Michigan. Calder was in practice. He worked on the construction of Cranbrook schools, where he famously measured the building wrong, and so it came up an inch short. And it didn't seem like Henry Booth ever let that go, because he constantly referenced Ralph Calder, my friend who measured the building an inch short. But he did stay in architectural practice. And so when Henry needed a licensed architect to actually draw up the blueprints for the building, he turned to his good old friend, Ralph Calder. There used to be a sculpture outside. You are correct. The sculpture was moved inside. It's now in the collection of Cranbrook Art Museum Collections Wing. So it is the collection of Thornlea House, but it's moved inside for safekeeping. There's just not a lot of people over here, and so even though public safety checks on the buildings multiple times a day, the decision was made for the safety of that sculpture, which no one was really appreciating back here, and now they can appreciate it on behind-the-scenes tour at the museums. Before I head inside, I thought we would get a sense of the building architecturally. So 1937 is an interesting moment in the history of architecture, because we are, of course, seeing the influence of modernism coming in. And so while the main Thornlea house is this interesting eclectic style of French, English, and Dutch architecture, the Thornlea studio, which has had its garage bricked in, is beginning to see the sort of streamlined flat surfaces of modern architecture. Particularly modern is the use of steel frame sash windows here, which we see are painted this teal color that Henry Booth enjoyed using in his watercolors and in his architecture. There's also, while it's not a flat roof, he's really thinned down any type of architectural ornament or molding. But there is the sort of remnant of architectural molding, if you will. I think a very sophisticated way of treating the intersection of the roof and the wall, where these little bricks are turned out. So you have two runners and then one header brick, the short end that is pulled out just 3/4 of an inch. And then if you also notice, the line of bricks right below the copper gutter is also pulled out to give it a little bit of dimension. Like so many Cranbrook buildings, it has copper gutters and then a clay tile roof above that. There are also these recycled chimney pots or chimney shafts that Henry Booth began using around this time, and he would use there multiple places at Cranbrook that Henry designed or redesigned, where he would take these cast concrete chimney internal fireproofing mechanisms. So this is what goes in the middle of the chimney from the fireplace up to the top of the roof, laid like this. It was a way of making a fireproof flue, and he would turn them on their side and use them as decorative blocks instead of as a chimney. So I think we can assume that the same block, that there are 4 of them here, 4 of them there, are then inside of that brick shaft, turned on its edge and stacked up in their sort of created purpose. Now, if you have other questions, do type them in as we walk around. The facade of the building, the largest part, is the window into the studio itself, which is just one large room on this end of the building. And then this beautiful bay window was where Henry had his office. And so he had a desk and chairs and books in this room. So Henry, of course, he continued to sketch and to paint throughout his life. He collected, and then he wrote about his collections. He wrote books. He wrote little stories, allegories, and parables. He wrote poetry. He was also deeply involved, as was Mrs. Booth, with Christ Church Cranbrook and the leadership there. Henry served on the boards of the Art Academy and of the Cranbrook Foundation and then Cranbrook Educational Community. So he certainly had enough going on that he needed his office over here. And he used the building really until about the late 1970s. And around 1977, it seems like from the record, he essentially gives Cranbrook Educational Community a key to this building. And so the community begins to use it while he was still using it as his offices. And so there would be functions here for Cranbrook schools and for faculty events. And I think Henry was, especially towards the last 20 years of his life, very concerned about maintaining community at Cranbrook. And I think he wanted the studio to be used as a place where people from the different institutions could gather socially. Now, when Henry passed away in his 90s after a very beautiful life well lived, in 1988, this building was given over to Cranbrook Archives, with the apartment remaining above, a separate place. Now, Cranbrook Archives had begun in the 1930s in the third floor of Cranbrook House, and then in the 1940s it moved to the west wing of the Cranbrook House, then moved to the basement, and then to the attic, and finally in 1988 it moved here, and Henry Booth left a generous endowment that still helps maintain Cranbrook Archives. So I'm sure many of you watching visited this building as the Archives from 1988 until 2012, when the Archives reading room was moved to Cranbrook Art Museum's lower level. At that point, this became not where you came to do research, but it is still used as storage. And so once we go inside, we are going to see that the building is still being used as one of the primary places for archives within the Cranbrook Archives collection. I should warn you, all of my loyal Live at 5 viewers, that Cranbrook Archives really needs a permanent home. Even since 2012, it has moved once again into the collections wing from the lower gallery. And there is no place on campus that is large enough or climate controlled enough to actually hold the entirety of the Cranbrook Archives collections. So what is actually in the museum are the most important papers and the most fragile, our architectural drawings, the Booths and the Saarinen's material, and things that are used most often, like school records. But the archives are much larger than what could be stored there. And so in here, we're going to see many, many more blueprints and building plans, as well as records that are used less often. It is the goal of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research to move into Lion House, or Thornlea, the Albert Kahn designed home, two houses north of here, once we have raised the funds and secured the architectural designs to build a new home of Cranbrook Archives. And that is something you're going to hear a lot more about. We launched that with the last fundraiser last summer, and are still working towards that goal so that this house can be cleaned out, the studio can be cleaned out, the archives stored in a state-of-the-art facility as opposed to in an adequate facility, and then this little studio, which isn't a floodplain, can be used for grander and more beautiful purposes. So with that out of the way, knowing that we're looking at a work in progress, I have been generously invited in by Deborah Rice, our head archivist, and Laura McNewman, our associate archivist. And we will head in past this lovely John Glick sculpture alongside the front door, as well as an alert that we have moved the archives. And we come into a charming vestibule in the studio. And it's just like so much architecture of the 1930s. We see the effects of the Depression in material choices, a combination of the Depression and modern material advances. And so we're seeing here linoleum floor, which is probably original, much like Saarinen, who used linoleum at Kingswood. It was a sort of wonder material, probably not what I would put in the foyer of a house. I love a nice oak floor, but we're going to see all types of materials here in the studio. We're also greeted by our founders, photographed here in 1928, George and Ellen Scripps Booth. And then there's also a wonderful little watercolor here, our pencil drawing by Henry himself. Remember, he studied architecture and was an architect in the 1920s and early 30s. And this is his proposal for an addition onto Cranbrook House. So where the library wing would eventually be built, this is Henry's idea of what his parents might do. So here you see the front of Cranbrook House, obscured by this plant. And then here you see his proposal for a brick tower and half-timbered wing on the side of the house. Now, there is this stairway that connects up to the apartment. We won't be going up there because the apartment is private residence, and I imagine that she is up there working from home. But we do have this fun little glimpse into the old vault of the archives, which, note, there is no stairway down, and so all of us who have to use this building jump between the two levels, or you can go outside and come in through the door. And so these are records, again, that are less commonly used, but still important for us to have. And you can hear the air circulating and ventilating system down here. So these papers are not in danger, even though they're a little bit hard to get to. Everything here is being safely and securely maintained, even if it is awaiting perhaps a more ideal home in the future. Next, we will head into the tile room. So there's a little bathroom between the spaces, and then this tile room, which used to be the offices of the archives, it now is where we process new and smaller collections. So if Anne Smith Tobes is watching, this is where the papers and films that she just sent about the Smith house, this is where the archivist can sit and they can begin to separate files that come in all types of boxes and bags and mailers and begin to lay them out and then separate them into boxes. So perhaps one day we'll have our archivist come and talk a little bit about their work, but I think it's interesting to see this process as the Cranbrook Academy of Art Women's Committee boxes are being made. And so these are temporary labels about what will likely be in box 8, publication series, and then photographic material series. And what Laura does is she takes the papers from these files where they're not indexed and they're not, if I was a researcher, I would have to go through the whole thing. And she begins putting every single item in a folder. It gets a label, it gets an index, and then me as the curator can come in and I can say, do we have a picture of these people? And Laura can say, well, I know exactly where to look. It's the Cranbrook Academy of Art Women's Committee Box 10 photo files. And then I can get into the folder. And these wonderful Sarnen tables that are being reused from somewhere on campus. Now, I mentioned that we would get closer to this wonderful door. Probably the most beautiful architectural feature of the little studio is the Thistle Door. And Thistle was Henry's nickname because when he was sick, he was growing sort of patchy young man's beard and he couldn't shave it. And his sister Florence said, "You look like a little thistle." And so Thistle becomes his name, his nickname for the rest of his life. Now, from the tile room, which has the same painted floor tile as the lower level of Thornlea, from North Africa, I believe, though I'm not sure if this is from North Africa or not. It does look like it's the same. We head into the main studio. And before I talk about what all happens in here, why don't we turn and we'll go up 2 steps. Perhaps you can see the steps there. Into what was Henry's office. And I did post a photo of Henry's office a couple of years ago on our blog. So I think if you just search either on our digital image database by Thornlea Studio, or if you Google image Thornlea Studio, you can see what these rooms looked like when they were set up as an office. What are all of these wonderful drawings doing in here? Well, this is the place where when things need to be expanded or corrected at Cranbrook, we don't come to processing tools. I'm sure that these bookshelves are left over from some other place on campus. But capital projects, our team of architects and builders, contractors at Cranbrook can come and they can study all of the changes that have happened to any Cranbrook building in the last 100 years. And so every drawing is stored here. And these are the working drawings. So these are the ones that we use every day. And then there are also archival copies that are stored at the Art Museum. And those are the ones that I usually look at as a curator because I'm not always as interested in building systems as I am in building design. Now, Henry's office back here, it has the bay window, and so we could open all of these and have his view back to the house over the snowy meadow. And thank you, Colette. The tiles are from Tunisia. They're part of that same purchase, which the tile room at Thornlea is made up of. Now, next we look down into the Henry's old studio, what had been the archives reading room. And again, it's a work in progress, but I will say, looking back at the photos of the archives when they were here in 1988, it's actually, I think, more organized and easier to use today than it was then, because we have been able to expand the footprint of the archives. Some of this furniture you'll recognize if you use the archives from 2012 to 2018. This is the old reading room table from our home at the Art Museum before we moved again to the collections wing. And then with coronavirus and the restrictions that we've had to have with our staff, it's been a blessing to have this building still be part of the archives family, because the archivists who used to work in essentially a small cubicle, all three of them back to back, they have now spread out. And so Laura can work here and Deborah can be at the Art Museum, and they can both work with more safety than if they were using their old cubicles. Now, it is a little bit hard to see, but there is this lovely little niche in the corner of the room where some of Henry's collection is still kept out on display. And then there is back here a fireplace that's covered to insulate the building and to protect the objects. But up above is this wonderful plaster mold of Marshall Fredericks's portrait of George and Ellen Booth that was done posthumously. The original sculpture, the main sculpture, is over at the Institute of Science on the wall, where it says Cranbrook, fruit of their vision and generosity. But Henry owned this plaster cast of it, and so it stays here in the studio. And I will just add that when I first started using or being able to visit in this building, the shelving was a little different, and so it had perhaps a more aesthetically pleasing view back to the fireplace. But again, it's a working space. This is a behind-the-scenes tour, and so the building is doing a lot of work. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting for us to be able to keep these papers in good order and to be able to allow researchers to access them. So if you are researching at Cranbrook Archives, you probably would never know that your papers were coming from a different space, but there are 4 spots on campus where the archive records are held. This is the sort of largest holding of them, and so Laura drives back and forth. So if I ask to see something and I'm in the reading room and she pulls it up and she goes, "Oh, Kevin, I'll be right back," I know that she has to not go to the basement of the Art Museum and pull it up, but drive over here and bring the box back. So it is no longer used as a public research spot. It's for processing, it's for storage, and it's for internal researchers. The last little aspect that I'll share 2 more stories. Thank you to one of my followers who pointed out that this was the headquarters of Paragon Productions, which is Henry and Carolyn's son Steve was a movie producer in Hollywood, and he made the film Bridie of the Grand Canyon, and we have wonderful little sculpture of Bridie, the donkey, in Thornlea House, and this was the production offices. Upstairs in the apartment that we won't be seeing, it's a pretty nice apartment, actually. I mean, the whole family lived up there in the 40s, but it was also used by the Sons to build their electric model railways, which it is a goal in my life to be able to have a room where I can build my Playmobil and my Brio. So that must have been fun for all of the sons of Henry and Carolyn. And the last thing that I'll share, looking just over my notes that I took down about this building, which I've never done a tour of, is a couple of years ago when I was curating one of my exhibits, I was on the hunt for any of the original drafting tables of Eliel Saarinen, and Gina Tekos, our former archivist, said, I think that there is a drafting table in Thornlea's studio that was Glenn Paulson's that was also possibly Eliel Saarinen's. And so using historic photographs, I was able to confirm that this is the only surviving drafting table of Eliel Saarinen, which is just kind of cool. Now, it doesn't have the original top, but which was probably replaced by Glenn Paulson. It has a more modern Formica top, and we know that Eliel Saarinen had a fully wooden drafting table. Part of what lets me know that this is Eliel Saarinen's, not only is it a 1-for-1 in the photograph, I mean, it is the table from the photograph, But if you look over here at Henry's drafting table, which has all these wonderful blueprints on it, this one is much longer. And Eliel Saarinen was famous for using a 90-inch drafting table. And so it is just a much bigger drafting table than most drafting tables would be. And who knows, one day in the future, when all of these archive records are in our new storage facility over at Lion House, maybe I can get a more historically correct top on this, and we could use it over at Saarinen House again, where this table spent the first 21 years of its life at Cranbrook as Eliel Saarinen. So thank you, Colette, for that comment. The family also lived upstairs during the Korean War, and so the family wasn't back in the big house until the early 50s. Thank you for that. I read the story about them moving over here in the during World War II, and then I read the story about Melinda not wanting to go back because she was embarrassed by her friends at Kingswood for living in such a big castle, and she thought if she could say this was her house, that would make her a little bit more cool, I guess, you know, more modest. So thanks very much for joining us on this short tour of the Thornlea studio. If you have other questions, you can type them in the comments really quickly because I'm about to sign off and I'll try to answer them. Or you can always email us, or you can email the archivist. And as I mentioned, this is a work in progress to try and build finally a permanent home for Cranbrook Archives. It's a goal that I think Henry and Carolyn wanted to see realized, and that Henry generously started off with that endowment that we still use today, and with the facility of Thornlea Studio, which he left to the archives, which we still use today. But I don't think he could have known that what was, in the 1980s, essentially a collection of Booth family papers would grow into a very large and internationally significant collection of not only institutional and family papers, but of artistic and scientific papers, of architectural blueprints, and personal records from really some of the most important artists and designers in the 20th century. I know we just got a very exciting collection into the door to be processed that I can't wait to tell you about. I'm not sure if it's public that he gave them to us, but Cranbrook Archives continues to grow, continues to improve, and continues to become a spot where students and researchers and curators can come and learn about the impact of Cranbrook on the world. And so as we have grown out of the Thornlea studio and as we grow out of the Art Museum reading room, I hope that you'll all stick with us here on the Center for Collections and Research Facebook page so that you can keep learning and seeing what we do next, onward and upward. Thanks so much for following along, and I will sign off here from the Thornlea studio, which is right on Cranbrook Road between Christchurch Cranbrook and the main Kingswood gates. So it's just a little house, and especially if you go by at night, if the fellow is home and the lights are on, it is this sort of very charming English modernist box over here in the snow. And just as a final reminder, a final plug, that the Cranbrook History of American Architecture lecture series is happening right now. Our third lecture is on Monday night. You can still get tickets, and I can email you recordings of the first two lectures. On Monday night, we had a guest appearance of one of the architects that I was discussing, which was pretty incredible. And on Monday, we'll continue right on into the 1980s. So sign up for that, and I can send you the lectures if you... And so I'll see you there on Monday, or I will see you next week on Wednesday for another Live at 5. Until next time, everyone.